Hey y'all, Jenovi here. Back in August, I hosted a panel for Uplink, which is a Long Island retro gaming event. It was in three parts. I covered the Jag, which has already been released on this channel, the 32X, which is this video here, and the Virtual Boy, which we'll be releasing in about a week or two. I think that if you enjoy what I do on this channel, you're really going to enjoy these videos as well, because they're essentially a crash course history on these three consoles. I invited RGT85 along for the discussion, so sit back and enjoy the conversation. I think you're going to like what we have to say.
So let's get into the 32X. Development started on the 32X in 1993, and it had two purposes in mind for Sega. The system was actually built around the SH2 processor, which is the same processor that was used in the Saturn. And even though development didn't start on these systems until 1993, the contract for these SH2 and SH1 processors from Hitachi was signed in 92. So Sega knew all the way back in 92 that they had this dual platform idea going forward. And there's no verification on this, but I think the idea is that, you look at the NES and the 2600, and you see that they were still having success in life after the prime of those platforms. Even when the Super Nintendo had come out or the Atari 5200 had come out, the 2600 was still seeing sales. So for Sega, it was a way to prolong the life of the Genesis and have it be kind of a budget console at that point going forward, and be able to support a new platform at the same time. The idea behind the hardware for the 32X specifically, we're talking, was to build upon the existing Genesis base. And so you have a familiar base for your developers, and then you add some new chips on that they can get familiar with before the Saturn actually launched. And I think that it needs to be said that for Sega, they felt that the North American market was key. You have the Genesis selling over 50% of the market share of that system in North America alone. And so, they launched the Saturn in Japan. That's kind of a test market for it. They launched the 32X in North America. That kind of preps everything. It gets people on board. They start better understanding that there's going to be this big transition from the way that games have been done for like the last 20 years. And and we're making this move to 3D. And it kind of gets everybody on board was the idea behind it before the flagship system ends up hitting at the end of 1995. Any thoughts on this so far?
No, I mean Sega. Sega did have Sega's North America market was definitely very, very important for them, especially with the Genesis because of the success of Sonic, which just took off. And a lot of people don't realize that Sonic wasn't quite as popular in Japan.
Yeah, it was the number one selling Japan in the number one selling system in Japan for the fourth generation was the Super Nintendo, and then the PC Engine, which is the TurboGrafx 16, and then Sega's Mega Drive. So they were really struggling to find any success outside of Brazil or North America. They had some success over there in Europe as well, but I mean, as far as their home country of Japan goes, they were flatlining. So everything that they do is essentially with a focus to at this point at least, the North American market. And if we actually look at a design philosophy, it kind of carries through the whole entire course of their consumer line of consoles. The Mark I, there's nothing special to talk about. It's just the start of their hardware. The Mark II, it introduces a new shell. You have a card reader slot, so it's a new form of media. It's cheaper for people to buy. You have a new controller. It's now inspired by the NES because that's launched in the meantime, and it's become popular. And the cable is now detachable. The controller was not detachable in the Mark I. You have the Mark III, which is essentially the Master System. It's a precursor to it, but it's essentially the same. And you can see that all of the enhancement chips from the SG-1000 are carried over, and that's the system that they use that as the basis for the Mark III. What that means is that you have full backward compatibility. Now, the main shift that you have when doing that is that they actually shift over to an RGB color palette. So if you're playing on a Mark III, a Mark I game, you're going to see colors that don't actually represent what should be on the screen. But for the most part, the Mark III played the prior generation's games. And this was like a really important design philosophy within Sega. When the Master System launched, essentially it's the same exact deal as your Mark III, but they updated the BIOS so it no longer supported Mark I and Mark II games. And we don't know why this was, probably for region locking stuff that was pretty popular back then. If you got the Master System in Japan, they also had an FM synth, and that wasn't carried over to the Mega Drive. But essentially, when you move over to the Mega Drive, you see that the whole Master System is carried over, and then the Mega Drive is built on top of the Master Master System. So you have all those important chipsets that are carried over, and you have almost near universal backward compatibility, and it's near universal because the Mark I and the Mark II had its video mode. It's called the TMS 9918, and support was dropped for that when the Genesis launched. So there's like a couple games. F1 Fighting Falcon is one of them, and they just don't work because it's not supported any longer. But we're just talking like 1 or 2 games, very minuscule. When the Sega CD releases, it's relying on the Genesis, and then when the 32X releases, it's also built upon the Genesis, and it uses these 2 SH2 processors. And when the Saturn releases, it's built upon these same 2 SH2 processors that you have in the 32X, which is connected to the Genesis. So you're still carrying on this design philosophy to where you have familiar hardware and new hardware. So familiar to really kind of ground these developers, and then new that they can get used to programming for. And then finally, you have the Dreamcast. And the Dreamcast essentially takes those SH2 processors and uses the new model, which is the SH4. And so there's a connection from the start all the way to the end with Sega. And you have essentially the same design team all the way through pushing this philosophy, which is really interesting. You don't have multiple teams. It's all Hideki Sato's teams designing from the first home console all the way to the last home console. And eventually, after the Dreamcast is done, he becomes president of Sega. So the Genesis 32X was planned as a full replacement for the Genesis in '94. It wasn't planned as a mushroom deal, and had a target price of $200.
I do wish that was sort of an all-in-one console, though, like the Neptune.
Oh yeah. This is essentially the idea. So the whole 32X idea was created, developed, designed in Japan. What the Sega of America contributed was software development kits, and they also proposed the idea of separating out the hardware from the system that you're looking at here into an add-on. And the idea was that they could reduce the cost if they weren't doing redundancy chipsets. So, it was already relying on the chipsets from the Genesis, and the idea was to have a full replacement, which, had the Genesis and this new 32X edition all in one unit. So if they can actually eliminate having to put those in from the get-go, they could drop the price to $150, which is essentially where the 32X was marketed at. And it would allow people who already had Genesis to upgrade. And then after the Saturn launch, they would be able to go back in about a year later and release the full realized idea, the all-in-one console, fully replacing the Genesis, and that would be able to be marketed also at $150 because enough time had passed that they'd be able to get the pricing down for the chipsets within those consoles. Which
would have been great, I think. I think that would have been more successful than, of course, it ended up being if it took off well. Because, an all-in-one console that does your Genesis stuff and does better games, it's being marketed at, because the Saturn came out at $400. That's a lot of money, especially when you're considering, inflation and stuff like that. So, this cheaper alternative that could still play, and I'm sure we'll get into it, but, that could still give you that arcade Sega experience at a fraction of the price. It's like, it seems like such a no-brainer to me.
I really appreciate what they were doing with this, and I feel like the misstep wasn't with the line of thinking and how it came down the pipeline, although maybe it was. But I think the misstep is all attributed to Japan and panic in launching that Saturn early, which we'll be getting into here in a second. So Sega decides to go ahead and run with this idea of this price-reduced add-on and pushing the idea of this full all-in-one system replacement down the road for a year into November of 1995. And the idea of releasing it about a week after the Saturn as a, like I said, as a budget entry into the 3D market. And because you have common chipsets shared between the platforms, the idea was also that you'd be able to kind of co-develop and release games a lot cheaper over the 2 platforms than you could just the one. So when the 32X launched, this is a article from Business Wire here. You can see it sold out. You couldn't buy one. If you pre-ordered one like I did, you got it. If not, good luck finding it on the shelves. They had a million pre-orders, and they were only able to manufacture 600,000, and they were sold out by Christmas of 1994. And I find this really interesting because when you actually start looking into 32X stuff, you'll see that the numbers sold are often targeted somewhere around that 600 to 660,000. And that number is strictly from pre-orders that were filled, 600,000 pre-orders, and pre-orders that were filled over Europe and Japan on the initial launch dates. They don't take into account anything after those dates whatsoever. So, they never add in anything in 1995. All your sales numbers that we have are 1994.
And it's crazy because
you can see
that right there shows that there's a market for it. Like that's good sales. Like for your first batch selling out like that, like creating a buzz and a demand, like crazy to see.
Yeah, incredible sales. And like I said, I went out and bought one of these systems day one. I bought every single game that came out for it. I continued to buy games for it as I could until they were phased out. And I just thought it was an incredible system at the time. And I'd have friends come over. I had a friend who had a 3DO, and he came over, and he was impressed with it. So I don't think you can say that when people saw the 32X that they were not impressed with it. You look back, and there's games like Cosmic Carnage that really aren't that great. But at the time, I guarantee you, if you had Cosmic Carnage and you had friends come over and they seen that, it was like something that you'd never seen before on screen. It was incredible. It really was incredible. And thankfully, a lot of the games have held up really well, even if the game like Cosmic Carnage really hasn't.
But yeah, the scaling in the game was very impressive. And then, you had Star Wars out there, which had, people like to rag on that game. I don't know why. When I got my 32X, I got my 32X used when it was kind of on the way out. But I got my 32X with Star Wars, and I was absolutely blown away by that. I was like, my Sega Genesis shouldn't be doing this sort of game with all these polygons and stuff like that. Like, I was absolutely flabbergasted by that game. And that was sort of what started my love affair with the system.
Yeah, it's really cool, and you have the carts too. It's I think everybody knows that you and me are really big fans of the hardware.
Oh yeah.
And I think it gets a bad rap. And a lot of people say it failed out the gate, and it's just simply not true. You can see here it was considered one of the hottest gifts of the holiday of 1994. It sold out. You couldn't get them, and all indicators in 1995. I had another post up here. It's I don't think I included it in the slide, but it might be. Let's see. I'm not sure. I don't think it is. So it's another post. It's at the end of 1995, just talking about how Sega was struggling with the Saturn, and they weren't supporting some of their other hardware, but they still had been outselling Nintendo and still outselling Sony. And at the close of 1995, they were still the top console manufacturer and seller of all of 1995, which I find very interesting because a lot of times they're painted as being just completely failing and stumbling, and they're gone by 1995, and Saturn's a disaster, which it was. But it's not strictly true. They were having success coming into early 1995, and then the Saturn releases. And if you don't know, it was planned for November of 1995, and they decided to go ahead and move it up to May. And what that does is that they can't fulfill all the pre-orders. They had a ton. I don't remember what the exact number was. I think it's like 500,000 or 750,000 pre-orders, and they can't even fulfill them. I think they shipped like 50,000 units. And part of the problem, we don't know if this is fact or not, but it's been speculated, is that it shared chipsets with the 32X, and the 32X was so hot that it was they were manufacturing those things like crazy. And the demand for the Saturn was so hot in Japan, there was a shortage of the SH2 processors. So when they shipped this thing early, they only ship it to 4 stores. I believe it's Babbage's, EB Games. I can't remember the other two, Walmart and Target or something. I don't know. That's probably not right. But one of the biggest ones that they ended up leaving off the list is KB Toy. And KB Toy, for me, was about the only place you can go and buy Sega systems out where I lived, within about a 120-mile radius. So the entirety of my childhood growing up, I never seen a Saturn. I never saw Saturn games for sale. They refused to carry them. And lots of other retailers over this deal of having the pre-orders not filled and not having them shipped on the surprise launch announcement in May of 1995 refused to ever carry the hardware going forward. And it just absolutely crippled Sega. So Sega Japan panics. And we know for a fact now that by about August of 1995, maybe a little bit before then, but by August, rumors were already abundant that they had abandoned all the rest of their hardware. They're canceling the Mega Drive. They're canceling the Sega CD. They're canceling the 32X. They're canceling the Pico. They're canceling the Game Gear. And it was true. They had decided that the way forward was to do away with all these other platforms, no matter the fact that they were selling like hotcakes still, and put all these resources into saving the Saturn, which they were never able to save it in North America, although it had great success in Japan and was a very profitable system over there.
Yep, outsold the N64 in Japan, which a lot of people don't realize that. They're like, but yeah, I mean, the Saturn was great in Japan, and there's so many awesome. I had someone asking me earlier if I was ever going to do a book on the Saturn, and I'm like, if I do, it would have to be North America, because there's so many Saturn Japanese exclusives, RPGs and stuff like that I would never be able to talk about, because I wouldn't be able to understand it or anything like that. But yeah, the Saturn was definitely very, very popular in Japan, especially compared to North American sales. It never really took off. I remember my mom taught preschool, and one of the parents had bought a Saturn on launch with Daytona USA, and I was so jealous of that person. I was like, can we go play at their house? And my mom's like, no, his son is just in my preschool class. And I'm like, well, I mean, you just like go over to the house, parent teacher conference, like, come on. She never took the bait with that, though.
Yeah, the Saturn's it's a really incredible system, and I don't want to get, we're kind of going to be running short on time here, so I don't want to get too far into it because it's not really the focus here. But they had an incredible sell-through for software for that system, and a lot of people don't realize that the Saturn was, like I said, it was very profitable, and it's because the software, the system attach rates were through the roof, unlike anything else. I mean, we're talking like 10 games to one console attach rates, where you look at something like the Dreamcast, and I think they're struggling to hit 6 games to one console. So, when you're thinking about, they're making $10 or $20 per game sold per console, and the Saturn is almost doubling the Dreamcast. You can see where these profits start coming in, especially when you consider that the Dreamcast and the Saturn sold about the same number of hardware units, but the Saturn sold almost double the number of software units. So, yeah, it's just really fascinating, the whole entire deal, and just Sega's decision going forward and what they did. And I just feel like it was really the wrong decision forward, but it's hard to say, But we do know that they almost went bankrupt, and they were saved by a very generous donation coming down the pipeline. So what are some of your favorite games on the 32X?
Virtua Fighter is probably my favorite game on the system, just because. A lot like the Jaguar games I really like, Virtua Fighter was a game that has no business, essentially running on a Sega Genesis via an attachment. Like, that was a great arcade-like experience. Virtual Racing Deluxe, Star Wars Arcade, Calibri is really good on there. Mortal Kombat 2, NBA Jam Tournament Edition. Like, I would say there's more good games than bad games overall on the system, but that's probably a lot of fanboyism talking. But for me, like, I don't know.
No, there really is more good games than bad games, and I don't think a lot of people realize that. If you actually look at the aggregate total, and I'm not saying that there isn't phenomenal games on other systems, but if you actually look at the games that are actually really worth owning on a lot of systems, it might only be 5 or 10% of the library. But on the 32X, it's about 50% of the library is really worth owning, and that's discounting sports games too. If you don't even include sports games, which is definitely, if you're into sports games, there's some sports games on there that are really worth owning, like FIFA 96, and 36 Great Holes of Golf is probably the best golf game ever created up to that point. Obviously, very limited appeal, but I mean, it just really speaks volumes about the quality of the library on the 32X, especially in 94, 95.
Yeah, definitely. It's a really neat little system that, and you got the Space Harrier and Afterburner on there. Like, it really, I wish that it was active for like a year more, at least a year more, because I think you would have seen some really crazy stuff. Like, when you look at the lineup of games that were canceled for it, Daytona USA, I think it would have been a competent Daytona USA port. It wouldn't have looked as good as the arcade version.
Oh man, yeah.
But when you look at Virtual Racing Deluxe, like, you could see that the system can run, Sega arcade games on it. When you look at Virtua Fighter, like, I think it would have been super decent. Castlevania was going to come out onto it. It's just that it's probably the biggest missed opportunity in gaming, because it should have been a success, but you had so many conflicting forces. Yes. Like all of the companies wanted to put games, like all of your major companies wanted to put games on it. Konami, Capcom, of course, first party Sega titles. Like, it drives me nuts to think about, because there could have been so many cool exclusives on it.
Yeah, it's just such a neat, especially going back, because it just really appeals to my senses. It's like the peak of 2D gaming with some 3D elements, and instead of going full 3D, it really appeals to the things that I love the most in gaming. I think it's why there's such a big attraction to the 32X for me. It's really such an incredible piece of hardware, and it's really unfortunate that we just didn't see more games realized on that platform. One really interesting thing about that, did you realize that Space Harrier and Afterburner both have full dual stick analog support on the 32X?
Really?
Yeah, there's a controller. I actually did a video on this. It's called the XE1AP. It was made by Microsoft. That's the same company that makes the upscaler that everybody uses.
Mm-hmm.
They actually got in bed with Sega and created this dual analog stick controller, the first all-in-one dual analog stick controller for the Genesis and 32X. And so if you play Space Harrier or Afterburner, you have a dual stick, full analog controller for both of those games, and it is a game changer. It makes, in my opinion, I think they're probably the best versions of those games on home console to this day because of that controller. But it's predicated on owning that XE1AP, which you can get on eBay for it's like about $80-$90.
I'm gonna have to check that out.
Yeah, you DM me. I'll send you the information on it. It's
all right, cool.
It's incredible that it actually exists, and it's so freaking good.
So, what do you think? Do you have anything to add to the discussion? Do you have any questions? You can comment below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Again, a couple weeks, you'll see the Virtual Boy video, and I've had a lot of crazy things happening in life, especially with these wildfires out where I live. So, I'm trying to get back to work on the channel as soon as possible. It's probably not going to happen as soon as I would have liked. Mid-October, early November, it's looking likely. I appreciate y'all tuning in, and until next time, thank you for watching Retro Impressions. I'll talk to you guys later.